On April 25, 2026, a Russian combat drone on a mission to strike Ukrainian targets didn't just miss, it didn't just crash. Fragments of that drone fell on NATO soil, Romanian soil. For the first time in this war, Russian military debris caused property damage inside the territory of a NATO ally. Romania scrambled Eurofighter Typhoons, Bucharest issued emergency alerts, and in Washington, a single question hung in the air. Is this the moment? The moment Article 5 stops being theory and starts being a trigger? On April 25th, Russian forces launched a wave of Shahed-type drones targeting Ukrainian positions near the Black Sea port of Izmail, a critical logistics hub on the Danube River, directly across from Romania. One of those drones, or pieces of it, came down in Galați County, Romania, not in a field, not in a forest. In a populated area, property was damaged, no injuries were reported, but the message was clear. Russia's war is no longer contained within Ukraine's borders. This wasn't a piloted aircraft. This was a loitering munition, what we call a kamikaze drone, and it represents something NATO has feared since February 2022, the creeping expansion of the battle space. Romania's response was immediate and telling. Bucharest activated its NATO air policing mission. British Royal Air Force Eurofighter Typhoons, stationed in Romania as part of a rotational deployment, were scrambled. Alerts were issued in Tulcea County, further south along the Danube Delta. But here's what makes this different from previous incidents. Romanian authorities confirmed this was the first time Russian drone debris caused actual property damage on NATO territory. Before this, there were near misses, suspicious radar contacts, debris found in rural areas with no confirmed origin. This time, there was no ambiguity. They condemned the incident as a serious threat to Black Sea security and NATO's collective defense. And they warned Moscow that any further violations of Romanian airspace would be met with the full range of alliance responses. Now, let's be clear. This doesn't automatically trigger Article 5. NATO's collective defense clause requires a deliberate armed attack. A piece of drone debris, even from a hostile military platform, exists in a gray zone, accidental, intentional, provocation. Test, but gray zones are exactly where wars escalate. And the Pentagon knows it. While the diplomats in Brussels parsed language, the machinery of U.S. military support to Ukraine kept turning, and it's turning faster than most Americans realize. On April 22nd, just 3 days before the Romania incident, the Pentagon signed additional contracts worth $6.8 billion in weapons for Ukraine under the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative, or USAI. Let me put that number in context. Since 2022, Congress allocated $33 billion for USAI. By October 2025, Ukraine had received $11.1 billion worth of weapons. But here's the kicker. The United States had contracted $32.3 billion worth of weapons by the end of 2025. That means nearly all the money Congress set aside has been committed to contracts, but only about 1/3 has actually been delivered. Why the gap? Because USAI doesn't pull weapons from existing stockpiles. It orders new production from American defense manufacturers, tanks, artillery, missiles, ammunition, built from scratch in factories across more than 70 U.S. cities. A 2023 analysis by the American Enterprise Institute found that Ukraine aid spending was funding defense manufacturing in more than 70 American cities. This isn't foreign aid in the traditional sense. This is industrial policy with a national security wrapper. Of the $32.3 billion in signed contracts, $18.2 billion has been paid. Another $14.15 billion is still pending payment. And the delivery timeline? Spread over the coming years. Ukraine is essentially locked into a multi-year resupply pipeline, regardless of who sits in the Oval Office. That backlog isn't because of laziness. It's because the U.S. defense industrial base, after 3 decades of just-in-time production and consolidation, is struggling to scale up for sustained high-intensity warfare. The Pentagon knows this, Congress knows this, and Russia knows this. Now, if you've been following U.S. politics, you know that support for Ukraine hasn't been a straight line. And the 2026 National Defense Authorization Act, signed by President Trump in December 2025, reflects that tension. The NDAA authorizes $901 billion in defense spending. That's $8 billion more than the White House requested. And buried inside that nearly $1 trillion bill are provisions that tell a fascinating story about where the U.S.-Ukraine relationship stands. The NDAA allocates $400 million in USAI assistance for Ukraine for each of the next 2 years, 2026 and 2027. That's down from previous levels. For context, military assistance to the Philippines is set at $1.5 billion. Ukraine, a nation actively fighting a major land war against a nuclear-armed adversary, gets $400 million through the Primary Assistance Program. But here's where it gets interesting. The NDAA includes a provision that significantly complicates any effort to reduce U.S. troop levels in Europe below 76,000. Currently, the U.S. has around 100,000 troops on the continent, the highest number in decades. The bill requires the Pentagon to conduct a full national security impact assessment, interagency consultations, and present findings to Congress before any drawdown below 76,000 for more than 45 days. And even after that, there's a mandatory 60-day waiting period. Translation: the next administration can't simply pull troops out of Europe on a whim. Congress has tied the Pentagon's hands. The NDAA also funds the Baltic Security Initiative with $175 million for Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. And it requires the U.S. European commander to maintain the title of NATO Supreme Allied Commander, Europe, SACEUR. These aren't just bureaucratic details. They're structural constraints designed to prevent any rapid decoupling of the U.S. from European security architecture. Even if the political rhetoric shifts, the institutional machinery is being locked in place. But the most significant provision, the one that Ukrainian officials and American defense hawks fought hardest for, is the prohibition on the Pentagon reclassifying weapons contracted for Ukraine as U.S. stockpiles. Here's what that means in plain English. Under USAI, the U.S. orders weapons from manufacturers specifically for Ukraine. Previously, there was a mechanism where the Pentagon could redirect those weapons to American units if they were deemed urgently needed. The NDAA closes that loophole. If a factory in Alabama is building 155 artillery shells for Ukraine, those shells are going to Ukraine. Period. The Pentagon can't change its mind and say, actually, we need these for our own readiness. This was a direct response to concerns that the Trump administration might slow walk or redirect Ukraine-bound weapons. Congress, in a bipartisan vote, 312 to 112 in the House, 77 to 20 in the Senate, said no. As of December 31, 2025, the U.S. Congress had made available $188 billion in spending related to the war in Ukraine. That's according to the Special Inspector General for Operation Atlantic Resolve. As of December 31, 2025, the U.S. Congress had made available $188 billion in spending related to the war in Ukraine. That's according to the Special Inspector General for Operation Atlantic Resolve. But not all of that $188 billion goes directly to the Ukrainian government. The actual aid directly supporting Ukraine is about $127 billion, according to the Kiel Institute for the World Economy. The rest funds the expanded U.S. military presence in Europe, regional stability programs, and support for other affected countries. And here's a crucial detail that gets lost in the political noise. A large share of that money never leaves the United States. It pays American workers in American factories to build American weapons. Some go to Ukraine, some replenish U.S. stockpiles that were sent earlier in the war. This is why the defense industry lobbies so hard for Ukraine aid. It's not charity. It's a stimulus package for Lockheed Martin, RTX, General Dynamics, and dozens of smaller suppliers across the defense supply chain. Since the start of the war, European countries collectively have provided more aid than the United States. That's a fact that surprises many Americans, because the narrative in Washington often frames Europe as free riding on American generosity. In 2025, the United States made no new aid commitments. European countries significantly increased theirs. And looking at cumulative totals since February 2022, Europe is now the larger contributor. This matters for two reasons. First, it undermines the argument that the US is carrying an unfair burden. Second, it shows that European strategic autonomy, the idea that Europe should handle its own security, isn't just rhetoric anymore. The money is following the words, all the money in the world doesn't matter if it doesn't translate into battlefield effectiveness. So let's look at what's actually happening on the ground and in the air as of late April 2026. Russia has made incremental gains throughout 2024 and 2025. Not decisive breakthroughs, not territory that changes the strategic calculus, but steady grinding advances along the Eastern Front. Particularly in Donetsk Oblast, Russian forces are targeting Slavyansk and Chasiv Yar. These aren't just dots on a map, they're logistics hubs and defensive anchors. If Russia captures them, Ukraine's defensive line in the east begins to unravel. General Valery Gerasimov, Russia's chief of the general staff, has declared Luhansk Oblast fully liberated. That's Russian propaganda speak for "we've occupied it." But militarily, it means Russian forces have a more coherent line of advance into Donetsk without worrying about their northern flank. Russia's strategy has shifted in a way that should worry NATO planners. Instead of trying to achieve a knockout blow, which they've failed at repeatedly, Moscow is now focused on what military analysts call systemic attrition. They're targeting Ukraine's supply lines, logistics hubs, rail junctions, ammunition depots. The goal isn't to win a decisive battle. It's to bleed Ukraine slowly, to degrade their capacity to sustain high-intensity operations until the political will to continue collapses. This is why the Danube River corridor, where that drone crashed in Romania, is so critical. Ukraine has shifted massive amounts of grain, fuel, and military supplies through river ports like Izmail and Reni after Russia targeted Odessa's seaborne trade. The Danube is now Ukraine's economic lifeline, and Russia knows it. Those drone strikes near the Romanian border aren't random. They're calculated. They're testing how close Russia can get to NATO territory while still claiming accident or technical malfunction if something goes wrong. That Kursk, where Ukrainian forces launched a daring incursion in 2024, is now seeing renewed Russian shelling. Moscow is methodically restoring border areas, pushing Ukrainian forces back, and re-establishing a buffer zone. This isn't fast. It isn't glamorous, but it's effective. And it raises a question that keeps American military planners awake at night. What happens when Ukraine runs out of manpower before Russia runs out of artillery? Now, let's zoom out, because what happened in Romania isn't an isolated incident. It's part of a larger pattern, one that points directly at the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, 3 NATO members, 3 countries that share a land border with Russia, 3 countries that Russian military doctrine treats as historical territories temporarily separated from the motherland. The Baltic Security Initiative, that $175 million in the NDAA, is a down payment on a much larger problem. The Baltic states have tiny militaries. Estonia's entire active duty force is smaller than a single US Army division. Their airspace is protected by rotating NATO detachments. Their coastlines are vulnerable. Their power grids are integrated with Russia's. If Russia ever decided to test NATO's resolve, not with a full-scale invasion, but with a little green men scenario, a cyber attack, a snap exercise that accidentally crosses the border, the Baltic states would have hours, not days, before they needed decisive NATO intervention. That narrow strip of Polish territory between Kaliningrad and Belarus is the most vulnerable 65 miles in Europe. Cut it, and the Baltic states are physically severed from the rest of NATO. No road, no rapid reinforcement. Russian military exercises have rehearsed exactly this scenario. Zapad 2017, Zapad 2021. Each time, larger forces, more sophisticated coordination, better integration of cyber-electronic warfare and conventional strikes. The NDAA's provision keeping US troops in Europe above 76,000 isn't abstract policy. It's a recognition that if the balloon goes up in the Baltics, the first 48 hours are everything. And American forces, already on the ground, already integrated with Allied command structures, already familiar with the terrain, are the only force that can guarantee a credible response. We can't talk about this conflict without addressing the nuclear dimension, because it's the reason NATO hasn't intervened directly. It's the reason Ukraine hasn't been given everything it asks for, and it's the reason every escalation, even a drone fragment in Romania, gets analyzed through the lens of potential catastrophe. Moscow has repeatedly threatened to use tactical nuclear weapons if its territorial integrity is threatened. They've moved nuclear-capable systems into Belarus. They've conducted exercises simulating nuclear strikes on European capitals. The United States has responded with its own signaling, deploying upgraded B-61, 1-2 nuclear gravity bombs to European bases, conducting strategic bomber flights near Russian airspace, and maintaining continuous at-sea deterrence with ballistic missile submarines. And psychological games get harder to play when one side is losing a conventional war and has publicly staked its prestige on not losing. If Russia faces a catastrophic military collapse in Ukraine, not just a stalemate but an actual rout, the pressure on Putin to escalate, to change the rules of the game, becomes immense. And NATO's challenge is to support Ukraine enough to prevent Russian victory, but not so much that Moscow feels existentially threatened. It's a razor's edge, and the drone incident in Romania is a reminder that accidents happen, miscalculations happen, and in a nuclear environment, a single miscalculation can have consequences that dwarf anything we've seen since 1945. So where does this go from here? Let me give you 3 scenarios. Not predictions, but frameworks for thinking about what comes next. Scenario 1. The frozen conflict. Ukraine holds the line elsewhere. Neither side has the strength for a decisive offensive. The war becomes a Korean-style armistice. Not peace, not war, but a permanent state of low-intensity conflict along a fortified border. This is what many in Washington quietly prefer. It's stable. It's predictable. It doesn't require American troops, and it keeps Russia bogged down indefinitely. Scenario 2. The Ukrainian collapse. Ukraine runs out of manpower. European aid dries up. As economic pressures mount, American political will evaporates. Russia achieves, if not total victory, enough territorial control to declare success and demand international recognition. This scenario keeps NATO planners awake at night, because a victorious Russia, emboldened and flush with captured resources, doesn't stop. It turns to Moldova, to the Baltics, to testing NATO's resolve in ways that could make the Romania drone incident look like a minor footnote. Scenario 3. The NATO trigger. Maybe next time it's not debris, it's a deliberate strike. Maybe it's not a drone, it's a cruise missile. Maybe it's not Romania, it's Poland. NATO invokes Article 5. American troops engage Russian forces directly. And the world watches as the two largest nuclear arsenals move closer to direct confrontation than at any point since the Cuban Missile Crisis. I don't know which scenario plays out. No one does. But I do know this. The decisions being made in Washington right now, the $6.8 billion in contracts, the 100,000 troops in Europe, the NDAA provisions locking in support are shaping which scenario becomes more likely. Most Americans couldn't find Bakhmut on a map. Today, they're watching drone fragments fall on NATO territory. $188 billion in taxpayer money flowing into a conflict 5,000 miles away. And a defense industrial base being rebuilt on the back of a war that shows no sign of ending. The Romania incident isn't just a news story. It's a data point in a larger trend. The gradual, almost imperceptible expansion of a war that was supposed to be contained. Each drone strike near a border. Each weapons contract signed. Each troop deployment extended. These are the threads that bind American security to Ukrainian survival. And whether you believe that's a wise investment of American power, or a dangerous entanglement we should have avoided, the reality is, we're already entangled. The question isn't if America is involved. It's how deep we go, and what we're willing to risk if Russia decides to test the limits. The drone that fell in Galați County didn't start a war, but it reminded us, in the most visceral way possible, that wars have a way of spilling over borders, crossing red lines, and forcing choices that no one wanted to make. If you want deeper analysis on US military strategy, NATO dynamics, and the weapons systems shaping modern warfare, hit subscribe. We'll be back with more.